On that night, the formation of American independence was laid. Not the Battle of Lexington or Bunker Hill, not the surrender of Burgoyne or Cornwallis were more important events in American history than the Battle of King Street on March the 5th, 1770. Founding Father, John Adams. Standing amid the skyscrapers of downtown Boston, where State Street, Devonshire Street, and Congress Street meet, lies the old State House. Built in 1713, it was known as the Town House until the American Revolution, when State Street was named King Street, and it was the center of the royal government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was here on March the 5th, 1770, that tensions between British soldiers and an unruly, boisterous crowd had boiled over. In an event that would see 3 locals lie dead and another 8 wounded, 2 of them mortally, it would serve as evidence of the tyranny of British rule and would be the spark that would light the fuse for independence. Join us as we explore the Boston Massacre. The morning of March the 5th, 1770, found the city of Boston on edge. Bostonians were fuming over the Townshend Acts, a series of measures that were passed by the British Parliament in 1767. Now, these laws were designed to tax the colonies on imports that they could only get from Great Britain, such as lead, glass, paper, and tea. With no representation in Parliament, the American colonists saw these acts as an abuse of power. To enforce these policies, as well as to maintain constant surveillance on the colonists due to their growing resentment towards the crowd, the British military was sent in. To further add to the mounting tensions was an incident that occurred less than 2 weeks prior. On February 22, 1770, 11-year-old Christopher Cedar, along with a dozen other schoolboys, were among a mob that included members of the Sons of Liberty that gathered in front of the shop of a man named Theophilus Lilly. Loyalist merchant Ebenezer Richardson, a most unsavory and dubious character who was also a confidential informant for the British, tried to defend Lilly's store, but was hit in the head with a rock and fled back to his house for his musket. There, the crowd followed, throwing rocks to his window, one of them striking his wife. He went up to a window on the second floor and shouted, "By the eternal God, I will make it too hot for some of you before tonight." Then he aimed his musket and fired into the crowd below. Christopher Cedar was hit. Christopher Cedar died when 2 musket balls struck him, one right above the heart and the other in his arm. He died at approximately 9 p.m. that evening. After Christopher was shot, the angry mob dragged Ebenezer off to jail. Christopher Cedar's body was taken to Faneuil Hall. The Boston Gazette would write, "We are fallen into most unhappy times when even innocence itself is nowhere safe." The funeral, arranged by Sons of Liberty leader Sam Adams, took place 4 days later and had a procession of over 2,000 Bostonians. Young Christopher's casket, inscribed with "Innocence itself is not safe," was carried from Faneuil Hall past the townhouse where the governor and council met, down to the Liberty Tree, then on to the Granary burying ground where he was laid to rest. John Adams would say, "My eyes never beheld such a funeral." The procession extended further than can be imagined. This shows there are many more lives to spend if wanted in the service of their country. It shows that the ardor of the people is not to be quelled by the slaughter of one child. Sam Adams called Christopher the first martyr to American liberty. The fuse was lit and the powder keg was set to blow, and it would on a cold wintry evening of March the 5th on the snow-covered cobblestones on King Street. March the 5th started with the same uneasy tensions that filled Boston for months, but that fragile calm was about to break. Just as it looked as if the day would come to an uneventful end, the evening would see violence and death. As if, on cue, Bostonians took to the street looking to agitate British soldiers into some sort of response. Throughout the city, groups of colonists came into contact with British soldiers, hoping but failing to provoke a fight. That would change on King Street. The spiral towards violence began when a 13-year-old wig maker's apprentice named Edward Garrick confronted John Goldfinch, a captain lieutenant in the British Army, for his negligence to pay a bill to his boss. The debt, in fact, had been paid. Private Hugh White of the 29th Regiment was on sentry duty in front of the custom house when he overheard this and moved to aid Goldfinch. As the young apprentice continued to mock the captain lieutenant, White yelled at Garrick, telling him that he needed to show more respect. Undeterred, Garrick responded with an avalanche of insults, then began to poke at the soldier. With his patience depleted, White gave the apprentice a knock on the head with the butt of his rifle, sending the agitator falling to the ground wailing in pain, with blood dripping from the blow. Young Garrett temporarily fled the scene, but soon returned with an unruly group of mostly youths, and, pointing at White, let the angry mob know that it was he who hit him. Someone rang a bell in a nearby church, drawing more people into the streets. The sentry found himself confronting the growing crowd. He stood his ground and called for the main gate. 6 men, led by a corporal, responded with fixed bayonets, but guns unloaded to White's relief. They soon were joined by the officer on duty, Captain John Preston. Daniel Usher, a Boston citizen, would later recount, "I saw several persons, mostly young folk, gathered between the townhouse and the coffee house, some of whom were talking to the sentinel at the commissioner or customs house. After some time, the boys distanced themselves and began to throw light snowballs at him, which he seemed much enraged at, and appeared to have charged his gun, giving it a heavy stamp upon the doorstep, as if to force down the lead. And he swore to the boys, if they came near him, he would blow their brains out." Soon the crowd swelled to almost 400 angry Bostonians. They began pelting the soldiers with snowballs, chunks of ice, and oyster shells, surging within inches of the soldiers, and they began to taunt them as well as daring them to fire. Charles Hobby, a Boston laborer, later testified, "Between the hours of 9 and 10 o'clock, being in my master's house, was alarmed with the cry of fire. I ran down as far as the townhouse, and then heard that the soldiers and the inhabitants were fighting in the alley. I then left them and went to King Street. I then saw a party of soldiers loading their muskets about the custom house door, after which they all shouldered. I heard some of the inhabitants cry out, 'Heave no snowballs!' Others cried, 'They dare not fire!' The soldiers loaded their guns. The crowd, showing no signs of backing down, closed in, called out, taunting the soldiers, 'Come on, you rascals, you bloody backs, you lobster scoundrels, fire if you dare! We know you dare not!' A Private Montgomery was struck by a rock, knocking him to the ground, causing him to drop his musket. He recovered his weapon and angrily shouted, 'Damn you, fire!' then discharged it into the crowd. There was a pause, after which the soldiers fired into the crowd. William Sawyer, a Boston citizen, testified, "The people kept huzzawing, daring them to fire. They threw snowballs, and I think they hit them. As soon as the snowballs were thrown and a soldier fired. I heard the club strike upon the gun, and the corner man next to the lane said 'fire,' and immediately fired. This was the first gun." The crowd retreated back. As the gun smoke cleared, Crispus Attucks, James Caldwell, and Samuel Gray lay dead, while Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr were mortally wounded. Maverick would die the following morning, and Carr 2 weeks later. 6 more men were wounded but survived. Around 10,000 people, or about half of Boston's population, attended the funeral for Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks, the first 4 victims of the massacre. The funeral, paid for and organized by Sam Adams, was used as an occasion to bring attention to the tyranny of British rule. Adams and the Sons of Liberty led the funeral procession to the Granary Burial Grounds, where the victims were laid to rest in the same burial plot as 11-year-old Christopher Cedar. 7 days later, the last victim of the massacre, Patrick Carr, was also interred in that same plot. Sam Adams was buried in the plot next to them when he died in October of 1803. Acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson was summoned to the scene and into the council chamber at the State House. From its balcony, he was able to restore order by promising that there would be a fair inquiry into the shootings that the crowd dispersed. Captain Preston and his soldiers were arrested the next morning and indicted for murder. They were held in prison pending trial in the Massachusetts Superior Court. Court officials postponed the trial until fall, allowing for the people of Boston time to cool off. The aftermath of the massacre saw all the British troops withdrawn from Boston. Between October the 24th through 30th and November the 27th through December the 5th, 1770, trials were held for the soldiers. John Adams, who believed that all men were entitled to a fair trial, defended the accused men. In the end, Preston and 4 of his men were acquitted, while 2 soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter and released after being branded on the hand. John Hancock, signer of the Declaration of Independence, would later say, "Let this sad tale of death never be told without a tear. Let every parent tell the shameful story to his listening children, till the tears of pity glisten in their eyes, or boiling passion shakes their tender frames." On behalf of the History and Heritage Explorers, I would like to say thank you. If you would like to learn more about the Boston Massacre, head on into your local public or school library, or you can check the description box below for a link to the Boston National Historic Park. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, keep on exploring.